Michelle, I put this video together for you because you're looking for ways to snake-proof some type of brooder structure for your chicken hens so that they can incubate your peafowl eggs for you. I think there's a couple of different ways to do what you want to do. One is that you just create a chicken pen, a poultry pen that is snake-proof, and you have nests set up inside that structure so that the chickens can incubate your eggs. That is not the way I would do it if I were going to let chicken hens incubate my eggs. The way I would do it is that I would have one large poultry enclosure that doesn't necessarily have to be snake proof because you're not going to raise chicks in that enclosure, but what you are going to do is normally you're going to have all your hens in that pen, and in that pen you're going to have boxes that are set on shelves or hanging from the wall that are nest boxes. And what's going to happen in that pen is you're going to allow your hens to have one or two roosters in there. Those hens will naturally go broody on their own eggs. When they go broody on their own eggs, what we would do is that we would wait till evening, and then we would take the entire nest box with the hen and her eggs and move it to a more limited enclosure. And I'll show you examples of what I would do to create that enclosure too as well. But in terms of if you're just going to do it in a enclosure for poultry or hens in general, this pen right here was originally built as a chicken pen, and it is built to be snake proof at this point in time. This is the pen though that if you've seen videos in the past when I used to post a lot in the chicken groups when I had the rare breed chickens, that Sam the snake lived in. Sam was a over 6 foot long oak snake, and we allowed him to live in this pen. There were Jubilee Orpingtons in here. He never bothered the hens. He did eat eggs. I've posted tons of pictures of that. You know, losing a couple of eggs a week was no big deal to us when we had this pen set up for the rare breed chickens. After I took the chickens out and started using this for younger peafowl, Sam left, and then I went ahead and put the snake proofing back in. So what I'm going to do is show you examples of how we make the pens snake proof, and while I may not show you exactly what you want to build, maybe you'll get some ideas of construction from what I'm going to show you. Snake proofing your walls is pretty easy. This pen uses a 1/2 by 1 wire. I would not use the 1/2 by 1 wire anymore. It does keep large snakes from getting out in the pen itself, but it's incredibly expensive compared to just hardware cloth. But you know, as you can see, in general, what you're trying to do is build your structure so that you've got flat faces all the way from the top to the bottom, and we're using roofing screws to hold the wire down. And as you can see, there's no gaps, no way for a snake to get in. Anywhere you're going to have overlapping seams, you know, you need to have a wood piece butted into the frame so that you can tie the wire down here too. And obviously you can see there's no way for a snake to get through those openings that exist there. There are no openings effectively. So where the pen meets the ground is usually one of the places people have problems with. I think there's two ways to do this. In this pen, we use both ways. On this side of the pen, what I've done is I've used a 24-inch wide hardware cloth, and it's tied to the wood structure with the screws, and then it's buried underground out the 18 or so inches after the wire curves out. And again, there's no openings because of the way it's tied to the pen structure for a snake to get inside that wire. Either under it, through it, around it, they just can't get through it. The other way to snake proof the bottom is using tin. Now in this case, I wanted the pen open all the way to the ground, so what I did was I cut some roofing tin into about 16-inch wide strips, and the rest of the 16-inch that you don't see here is buried in the ground. But again, the tin is up tight against the wire, so there's no opening for the snake to get through. It also prevents other animals from digging in just because of how deeply the tin is buried as well. Another area that people struggle to make snake-proof is where their rafters come through or where their roof touches the top of the pen and ties to the structure. Again, the way we built this pen is overkill. There's rafters here. This thing could survive a, Category 5 hurricane. I would not build this pen again today if I were building it from the beginning. But what you can see is if you use rafters, you use block pieces the width of the rafter so that there's no opening for the snake to get through. Now, almost every type of tin, and this is a hybrid roof type material, almost every type of roofing material, they actually make a piece that you can put in here to seal these gaps. And in this pen, there is a rubber piece on the inside that follows the contour, that when the roofing was nailed down, it fills those gaps so that a snake can't go through that gap. The other thing you can do, and what we do now a lot of times, is instead of buying that piece, we get expanding foam, and we spray expanding foam into those gaps, and once it dries in a few hours, nothing can get through there. And we found that expanding foam lasts a long time. The only thing you need to be careful of is don't spray too much or get the foam that's low expanding, because you don't want it to look like a mess on the outside. When you build your doors, you have to build the doors such that the size prevents the snakes from having an opening to go through, or you have to use some type of gasketing material. We've done both. What we found is I have just gotten good enough at building these doors with a very narrow gap, and sometimes in the case where the gap might be questionable, I'll actually install a piece of trim so that when the door closes, there is no gap between the door frame and the pen frame. So as I said at the beginning, I would not build just a poultry house and let a multitude of hens try and incubate and hatch chicks in it. The problem is the hens get up, another hen comes back to the box. If the boxes are too big, you get two hens on the same set of eggs. And I don't care how good a setter your chickens are, eventually you'll have problems. And you'll begin to lose way too many chicks. You lose the advantage of the broody hens over a normal incubation. If I were going to go back to broody hens, and I won't just because of the time it takes and the time I'm away from the farm, if I were going to do it, I would build something similar to what I built before. And I've torn those pens down so I can't show you directly, but I can give you some good examples based on this brooding pen that we use right now. So what you're looking at is one of two brooding pens that we use for our peafowl. The peafowl go into here anywhere between 1 week of age and 2 weeks of age. And no matter how valuable the chick is, they go through one of these two little brooder barns. These brooder barns are open at our farm. They're not hidden away, they're not protected. We don't have livestock guardian dogs. Tonight after dark when you come out here, there's going to be raccoons out here, there's going to be possums out here. There's two pairs of skunks that call our farm home. I would no more think about shooting any of those animals or trying to keep them away than trying to make the sun shine or a rainstorm. It's just not practical when you live on 170 acres of essentially wooded forest. And beyond all those animals that might come out of the woods, there's 20 feral cats here. You don't think for a second If those cats could find a way into those pens, they'd eat every single one of those chicks. They do leave my adult birds alone, and the few immature birds that are 6 months or so that we'll put on the ground because we can't sell them, but they will eat anything small. So this pen has to be built for those feral cats too as well. But more to the point, and what you're worried about is snakes. Obviously, given how open this brooder pen is, we have snakes everywhere here. If you gave me 30 minutes from right now, I could find you close to a 6-foot oak snake somewhere on the farm property within the pen spaces. So this brooder barn and its sister had to be built to be snake proof as well. And it doesn't take a lot to make them snake proof. It just requires that you build frame boxes that you can attach wire to that has no gaps, large enough for a snake to get through. You'll have to pardon me a little bit. I'm going to show you what type of structure exactly I would build if I were going to use chickens again, but I'm going to talk a little bit about this brooder barn because I've got somebody else that wanted to see some detailed video of it and why I built it this way. So you'll notice that, you know, this is a pretty large structure. It's certainly overbuilt, but you can kind of get a feel for how many chicks are in here and what the value of those chicks would be. You know, you can't build something cheap and expect to raise the birds and keep them safe. There's a couple of things I've learned from doing this that I think are pretty important for raising birds up on wire like this and being able to get a lot of them in a relatively smaller space. I think the biggest thing I've learned is that there has to be a lot of circulation available. I'll get a closer picture, but in the first stage of this thing on the left where the smaller birds are, there's two 250 heat lamps in each of those sections. It gets pretty warm in there, and those sections are fairly small. So you need good circulation so that underneath the heat lamps it's warm enough for the birds, but you can provide areas that are cool enough to make their surroundings more natural, like they would be if they got up underneath mom for a while and then came out and roamed around for a few hours. And I'll shoot a close-up here in a second. But one of the things I wanted to point out is you'll notice that the roof is raised up above the pens themselves. The roof, the wire roof of these pens is at this level, but all of this is open and the tops of these pens are wire. The bottoms of the pen are wire as well, so that the droppings can pass through and I can pick them up. But I think increasing the circulation in these structures that I have is by far the best thing that I've done. Now I've built this structure so that there's actually pins on 3 sides, and you can walk into this thing. And I did it because it's nice to be able to work with the birds and tag them or check them or do whatever you're going to do when the weather is bad. And having the open inside like this lets me work them no matter how bad the weather is. So that's kind of why I built this way. A lot of people would just build a long linear, and I'm going to show you an example of what that might look like if you did that. So again, here you can see that this thing is just built with 2x4s as a frame butted together so that you have flat faces so that you can attach your wire. And once again, the wire is attached with roofing screws. We do that because if the wire gets bad, it's easy to unscrew and replace. If you use a nail or something more permanent, it's much harder to remove the wire than using screws. But you can see both faces are flat and the wire is connected. No snake can get through there. I've never had a snake get into any of these pens. It would not be uncommon for me to find a snake around this pen or even up on the top of these pens occasionally. So you can see how the wire floors are attached to the frame. The wire just extends to these pieces, these structural pieces that butt into the frame, and then we use intermediate supports too as well. Forgive the poop, but we actually work in this thing. see on the outside, you can see how that wire is attached. We cut out the corners so that there are no gaps. And again, we build our door frames with pretty close tolerances so that there's no gaps big enough for a snake to get through. That gap looks pretty big on the video, but it's actually fairly narrow, as you can see from my finger. And the wire inside is attached the same way. It's attached just to the flush frame so that there are no gaps. And just to give you an idea what the inside looks like, so on the top of the pins, there's also wire attached with no gaps. It's attached to the top of the 2x4s. The only penetrations are for the electrical cords for the lamps that go in. Where you do make a penetration, like the 2-inch hole that this PVC water line went through, and there's a gap that a snake might get through, we've come back and added a piece of wire to fill in that gap. And that piece of wire is of course removable too in case we have to work on the water line. Here's what the watering systems look like in these pins. They're just chick waterers with a PVC line that passes through. There's a valve on each one of them so we can work on them if we need to. The heat lamp setup is pretty simple. One of them is mounted on the structural piece on the outside of the frame, and then we hung a 2x4 from the top structure for the second lamp, and you can see those 2x4s run down, and we can adjust the lamps up and down to get them at the right height. So the question is, what would I build if I were going to use broody hens to incubate my peafowl eggs? I'd use what I used previously when I actually used some broody hens. What you're looking at in front of you is the end section to this brooder pen, and you'll notice that essentially the roof doesn't give the ventilation that the rest of this pen provides. The roof actually sits and acts as the top of the pens instead of the wire. If I were going to use broody hens, I would use a large poultry pen where there were removable nest boxes, where I could get the hens broody on their own eggs in that, and move them at night or in the evening in those nest boxes, eggs and hens all, to a smaller brooding pen. And I would probably have the brooding pen large enough or segmented such that there can only be 2 nest boxes in at one time. And what I would do is I'd probably just either build individual 4-foot or 3-foot long pens to accommodate 2 nest boxes, or I'd build long linear sections of these brooding pens. And the way I'd build them is exactly what the end section of this brooder barn looks like. I would use the roof, a slanted roof on top of it, overhanging far enough at one end, the back end, so that the rain couldn't splash in, and also overhanging in the front end too, so wind couldn't blow the rain in. Now this enclosure is pretty tall. You really only need something that's about 24 inches tall. So imagine the roof lowered to about right here. This pen is also too wide to use. I would probably use a 24 or a 30-inch wide pen. And then this thing would be segmented off so that there would be 2 nest boxes able to be put in each segment. When you shorten the roof down and the top of the roof is only at this height, the front doors, I would probably make swing up doors. When I built my last one, they were swing out doors. And the doors were too small sometimes to reach in and grab what I wanted in the far corners. So I would probably just put them on a hinge and make them swing up. That would be easier to make snake-proof too, because the door would just swing down on the frame itself and create a situation where there were absolutely no gaps. But that is what I would do. And again, how to mount the wire on the sides and the bottom are the same. How to mount the roof is the same way you would mount the roof on the original pin that I showed you that was an ordinary coop. And I'll move the camera now and kind of set it up at the end and show you how we've done that on this section too as well. So here it is showing the end, kind of an end picture. And again, you can see how the wire is mounted flush to the frame. No snakes can get in. And we've used trusses in this situation, or rafters, excuse me. I wouldn't do that. I would lay the 2x4s flat down, but you can see how we've blocked out what would ordinarily be a gap up here. And we also use the spray-in foam to close any gap between the roofing and that top piece. But if you lay the 2x4s down, you won't have such a big opening, and you can close it with a 2x4 stuck sideways instead of up on its end like this one is. But if I were going to provide a way for chickens to incubate my peafowl eggs, that's what I do. It would look similar to this section on the end. And here you can get a better feel for what it looks like from further away. I would just build that entire end structure, just not attached to the rest of the brooder barn. The tin would just be wide enough to come out the front and provide some protection to the front as well. You can see how I use this poultry screen to screen the sun. I use it so that it can be rolled up like you see on that section right there. So if you're going to have several rainy days in a row, you can close it down to keep heat in. If the weather's going to be nice, you can roll it up. If it's going to be super, super hot, you can roll it back down again. But that gives you a good way to provide for some protection from sun and rain, give you a little more temperature control. So that's what I would do if I were going to use broody hens again. I'd either build a bunch of what you see as this structure on the end freestanding, or I'd probably build long linear sections of this and then screen off. Probably I would not make the sections lengthwise any longer than 36 inches, just able to hold 2 nest boxes and allow those 2 hens to come out and drink water and eat feed and go back into their nest boxes. That prevents hens from switching boxes, or in this case only gives them one other box to go to and narrows their selection. So if they do cross over, odds are the other hen is going to go get back in the other nest box. That very rarely ever happens, or very rarely ever happened when I was using this before. And I think the people that are using that system are having pretty good luck. I know Josh Nelson at Rocking BAB uses that type of system. And for those of you that wanted this video because of the brooder barn, I'd build it the exact same way over again if I needed to build another one. I don't think there's anything wrong with building long linear sections of this instead of the square that you see that I built, but I really, really enjoy being able to go inside the middle of this thing when the weather's kind of crappy and being able to work those birds when I can't do anything else on the farm. And if you build long linear sections, to be able to do that, your roof has to extend so far that you might as well have built the other half of it anyway. It just seems more economical when you do it this way. So again, I would not build it any other way. If I had to build it, like I said, I have 2 of these. If I had to build a new one, I'd build it the exact same way. It would look identical to this one. So that's it, guys. If you got any questions, let me know. If you have questions about the build, I'll be more than happy to take detailed pictures of it. Just let me know.